The morning Aaron Ford realized he had stopped counting the rows was the same morning he stopped caring whether the sun rose at all. He stood at the edge of his wheat field in the late summer heat of 1882, somewhere in the dust-bitten stretches of Kansas, with a hand-rolled cigarette dangling from his lip and eyes so hollow they might have been carved out by a dull knife. The field stretched before him in terrible abundance, wheat stalks heavy and golden, bowing under their own weight like penitents at Sunday service, and every single one of them needed to come down before the first hard frost. He had maybe 3 weeks if the weather held, maybe 2 if it didn't. He was one man. One man with 2 hands, a broke-down harvesting rig that had thrown its main blade assembly 6 days ago, a mule named Patience who was living up to her name by dying slowly, and a neighbor boy, Tommy Briggs, who had helped for exactly 4 days before his own father called him home to work their claim. Aaron had a list in his head of all the things that needed to happen, and somewhere around the 3rd day of working alone, the list had gotten so long it had dissolved into a kind of white noise that hummed behind his ears from sunup to sundown. He was 28 years old, and he felt about 63. His father, Elias Ford, had worked this same land for 15 years before a bad winter, and a worse case of pneumonia had taken him 3 springs ago. Aaron had inherited the property, the debts attached to it, the busted equipment in the barn, and a profound sense of obligation to something that had already consumed one man entirely. He stayed because leaving felt like a second death for his father. He stayed because the land, when it was good to you, was the most honest partner you would ever know. It didn't lie, it didn't leave in the night. It just demanded and demanded and demanded, and if you met each demand it gave you back something real and solid you could hold in your hand and call yours. He had loved this land once. He was trying hard to remember that feeling now. The wheat stood quiet in the morning air, which was already gathering heat like a fire gathering tinder. Aaron took a long drag from his cigarette, looked at the field, and said out loud to no one, "Well, you win today." He turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, a low, wind-worn structure that sat in the middle of the property like a fist pressed into the earth. The porch boards creaked under his boots. The front door needed a new leather hinge. The kitchen table had a leg that needed reseating. The list went on. It always went on. He put the coffee on, stood at the window, and watched a hawk circle high and lazy over the far tree line. There was something in the hawk's ease that he resented this morning. He was aware that resenting a bird was a sign that things had gotten bad inside him, and he resented that too. The sound of a wagon reached him before he saw it. It came up the main track from the road, a modest buckboard with a single bay horse pulling it at a steady walk. Aaron set down his coffee mug and moved to the porch, squinting against the morning glare. The wagon carried a trunk in the back and a woman on the bench, holding the reins with practiced ease, sitting straight up in the seat like she had somewhere important to be and was not in any particular hurry about it, which was a combination he found immediately curious. She pulled the horse to a stop in the yard, looped the reins over the brake handle, and climbed down with no ceremony whatsoever. She was perhaps 24 or 25, dark-haired, with a face that was neither soft nor hard but somewhere more interesting than either. She wore a plain cotton dress in a faded blue that had probably been bright once, and she had the look of someone who had already been awake for several hours and had made productive use of the time. She carried a carpetbag in one hand. She looked at Aaron standing on the porch, and she looked at the field, and she looked back at Aaron. "You are Aaron Ford," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. "I am Susan Monroe. I wrote you a letter in June. You wrote back in July. You said you needed a farmhand." Aaron stared at her for a long moment. He had, in fact, placed an advertisement in the Wichita paper in late spring, looking for a hired hand with experience in wheat farming. He had received 7 responses. 6 of those had been from men who had demanded wage terms he could not meet. The 7th had been from a Susan Monroe of Lawrence, Kansas, who had said she was experienced with harvest work, could drive a rig, knew grain from chaff in every sense of the word, and would work for a modest wage and room and board. He had replied with guarded interest and then heard nothing more, and after 6 weeks had assumed the correspondence was dead. "I thought you weren't coming," he said. "I got held up in Lawrence," she said. "My mother was sick. She passed in late July. I had affairs to settle." She said it plainly, without reaching for sympathy, the way someone says a hard thing when they have already made their peace with it. "I'm sorry," Aaron said, and meant it. "Thank you." She looked at the field again. "Is the position still open?" He looked at the field too. 20 rows, 30 rows, 100 rows of wheat standing unpicked in the late summer heat. He had stopped counting. She had shown up. He was not a man given to reading signs in things, but something in the plain coincidence of it, the morning he gave up and the morning she arrived, lodged itself in his chest like a warm coal. "Yes," he said, "it is." "Good," she said, and set down the carpetbag and pushed up her sleeves. Right there in the morning yard, with the bay horse standing patient behind her and the wheat field glowing gold in the distance, Susan Monroe rolled her sleeves to her elbows and looked at the field with the focused calm of someone assessing a job that needs doing and has already decided to do it. There was no performance in it, no announcement. She just looked at the work and rolled up her sleeves, and Aaron found himself staring at her the way you stare at something unexpected that turns out to be exactly what was needed. "I'll need to see the equipment," she said, "and the mule, if you have one." "The rig is broken," he said. "Main blade assembly. The mule is sick." "What kind of sick?" "Slow sick. She's eating barely. I think it's her hooves." "Has she been standing in wet ground?" "We had a wet May." "Yes." Susan nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "Then it's probably thrush or early laminitis. Either way, she needs her hooves packed and she needs dry ground. I can look at her." She paused. "After I see the rig." Aaron came down off the porch. He showed her around the barn. She inspected the broken harvesting rig with quick, intelligent hands, turning pieces over, reading the damage the way someone reads a letter. She asked about the blade assembly, whether he had the components to repair it, or whether something needed sourcing from town. She asked about the honing stones, about whether the hand scythes were sound, about the grain wagon's condition. She asked without stopping, without gap, one question following the next in a way that felt not like interrogation, but like a mind working through a problem out loud. She looked at Patience, the mule, and bent down and lifted each hoof in turn and examined them with a steady professional gaze. "Thrush," she confirmed. "Not too far gone, but she needs treatment. Do you have pine tar and oakum?" "I think there's pine tar in the back of the barn." "Good. We'll pack her hooves tonight and keep her in the dry stall. She should be usable in 2 or 3 days if we're careful." She straightened and brushed her hands on her dress without any self-consciousness. "In the meantime, show me where you want to start on the field." Aaron showed her. They started in the far southeast corner, where the wheat was ripest, working with hand scythes because the rig was down. Aaron had not used a hand scythe for an extended stretch in years, and had forgotten the particular exhaustion of it, the way it worked not just your arms but the long muscles along your back, the way the rhythm of it either became something close to meditation or became pure grinding torment depending on how you held yourself. Susan Monroe held herself well. She did not complain about the heat, which by mid-morning had become something substantial. She moved at a pace that was deliberate rather than frantic, and when Aaron's pace started to slip under the heat and the weight of tiredness, her steady rhythm beside him pulled him along without her saying a word. They broke at noon for water and the hard bread and salted pork he had in the kitchen, sitting on the porch because the house was not much cooler than outside, and at least on the porch there was the suggestion of a breeze. Aaron poured 2 cups of water from the jug and handed her one, and she drank half of it in one long pull and then sat quietly looking at the portion of field they had cut. "We got maybe a tenth of it today," Aaron said. He was not complaining, just saying the fact. "More than that," she said. "I was counting. We cut about a third of the south section. If we keep pace and get the rig working, we can finish the south half in a week." He looked at her. "You were counting." "Someone has to," she said, without sharpness, but with a kind of directness that landed somewhere between a joke and a reprimand and made him smile despite himself. She saw the smile and something shifted briefly in her expression, not quite a smile back, but the precursor of one, like light behind a curtain. "You do not strike me as someone who gives up easily," he said. "I do not," she agreed. "But I am also someone who believes in eating breakfast before the work, which I did not this morning because I was on the road early. So if you are planning on keeping me fed, I should mention that I will work considerably harder on a full stomach than a half-empty one." "I'll keep that in mind," Aaron said. He paused. "Can you cook?" "I can cook," she said. "Can you?" "After a fashion." "Then we cook in turns," she said. "That way neither of us resents the other for it." It was such a reasonable, unfussy arrangement, stated so simply, that Aaron found himself nodding before he had even fully thought it through. She had a way of settling things quickly that he found disorienting in a way he couldn't yet identify as pleasant or unsettling. Both, maybe. Possibly the same thing. He showed her the spare room off the back of the house, which was small but private and had a window facing east. His mother had used it as a sewing room years ago, and it still had a particular quality of quiet about it. Susan set her trunk and carpetbag down without comment and looked around with the same assessing gaze she had given everything else, nodded once as if to mark it satisfactory, and then said they should go back to the field. So they went back to the field. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so immediate and consuming that Aaron barely had time to think about anything except the work. They were up before dawn, ate while it was still dark, and were in the field as the first gray light edged up from the east. Susan was never not awake before him. He would come into the kitchen to find the coffee already on, and a pan of something already going on the stove, cornmeal mush, or fried salt pork, or eggs from the 3 chickens in the coop out back. And she would be sitting at the table with her hair pinned up, and her sleeves already rolled, reading whatever scrap of newspaper or almanac she could find, completely contained in herself the way that genuinely competent people tend to be. She treated him with a kind of matter-of-fact respect that was different from anything he had experienced much. The women he had known, and he had not known many with any closeness, in the way of the frontier, where time and circumstance did not leave much room for the ordinary social machinery that might otherwise produce something, had either been entirely domestic in a way that made him feel he was not seeing them fully, or had been possessed of a kind of pointed neediness that exhausted him. Susan Monroe was neither. She talked to him about the work, about what needed to happen, about what was going wrong and what was going right, and she did it the same way she did everything else, directly and without ornament, and yet there were small things, small ordinary things that he started to notice. The way she laughed when something genuinely struck her as funny, quickly, bright and clean like a struck match. The way she looked at the field in the evening light when the cut wheat glowed copper gold, standing still for a moment with her hands at her sides, and her face gone soft in a way that was entirely different from her working face, as if the beauty of it caught her off guard no matter how many times it happened. The way she took her coffee with a very small amount of sugar and always made sure there was enough sugar left for his. Small things, the currency of days shared. On the 4th evening, they repaired the harvesting rig together in the barn by lantern light. It was a complex business, requiring both patience and a degree of mechanical intuition, and Aaron had attempted the same repair twice before and lost his temper on both occasions. Susan spread the components on the barn floor, sorted them with a clear, methodical hand, and then sat back and looked at them in the way she had of looking at problems, as if she were waiting for them to explain themselves. "Your father's rig?" she asked. "Yes," Aaron said. "I think the blade assembly was original to it. 15 years old, maybe. Some of these pins are worn smooth," she said. "That is probably why the assembly kept slipping. The tension was never right." She held one up in the lantern light. "Do you have replacement pins? Anything close to this gauge?" He thought about it. went to the back of the barn and dug through the hardware box his father had kept, a rusted tin full of bolts and pins and small pieces of iron whose purpose he had never known but had never thrown away. He brought it back and set it in front of her, and she went through it with both hands the way a prospector goes through river silt, quick and thorough. "Here," she said. She held up 2 steel pins that were close to the right gauge. "These will do. Have you got a file?" He had a file. They spent the next 2 hours working the pins down to the right dimension, test-fitting the blade assembly, adjusting, testing again. Susan worked the file herself for much of it, sitting cross-legged on the barn floor with the piece braced between her knees, completely absorbed. Aaron handed her tools and held things steady and watched her work and felt something he had not felt in a long time, a warmth that was nothing to do with the September heat, something quieter and deeper and considerably more dangerous. "Where did you learn mechanical work?" he asked. "My father," she said, not looking up from the file. "He was a farmer too in Lawrence County. We had poor equipment always, and we could never afford the blacksmith for every little thing, so he learned to do most repairs himself. He taught me." "Is he living?" "No, he died in 1879. It was his heart." She said it the same way she had said her mother died, plainly, without collapsing into it. "After that it was just my mother and me on the farm until she got too ill to work it. We sold the property last spring. I was looking for work." "The advertisement," Aaron said. "The advertisement," she confirmed. "I had done harvest work before, hired out to neighbors when my father needed the income. I figured I knew enough to be useful." She looked up then briefly and met his eyes with an expression that was part self-assessment and part something more careful, as if she were measuring how he heard her. "I hope I have been." "You have been," he said. "You've been more than useful." He paused. "You saved this harvest, I think." She considered this. "We have not finished yet," she said, but her mouth twitched slightly at one corner and she went back to the file. "The rig worked the next morning. Not perfectly, it rattled and complained, being old, but it worked, which meant they could move 3 times the ground in the same span of time. Susan drove it without hesitation." Aaron had expected to have to show her the operation at length, but she had asked 3 precise questions while he hitched the mule to it. Patience's hooves had responded well to the pine tar treatment, and she was walking steadily now, and then climbed onto the seat and drove off into the wheat like she had done it 10,000 times. He watched her go and felt something so foreign to his recent experience that it took him a full minute to identify it. It was relief. Deep, bone-level relief. The kind that comes when you have been carrying something heavy for so long alone that you forgot carrying it could be otherwise. He picked up his scythe and went to work on the sections the rig couldn't reach, along the fence lines and around the stone in the north corner, and the sound of the rig moving through the wheat drifted across to him like music. Their neighbors, naturally, had opinions. Harlan Briggs, Tommy's father, came by on the 5th day to return a fencing tool Aaron had lent him, and stood in the yard looking at Susan on the rig, with the expression of a man trying to compute something his arithmetic did not quite accommodate. He was not a cruel man, Harlan, but he was a conventional one, and convention in Callaway County in 1882 did not particularly account for a woman driving a harvesting rig for wages. "That your hired hand," Harlan said. "That is Susan Monroe," Aaron said. "She's been indispensable. She's a woman." "Observant of you, Harlan." Harlan gave him a look that was part disapproval and part something that was trying to figure out whether Aaron was making fun of him. "Folks are going to talk. Folks can work on my harvest or they can talk about it," Aaron said evenly. "Those are both things they can do. I have no strong preference." Harlan went home. Aaron figured that the conversation would reach the general population of Callaway County by Friday, which was roughly when he stopped caring about it. What he had not anticipated was how it would reach Margaret Tilby, who ran the dry goods store in Calvert Creek, and who was the widow of a man who had courted Aaron in a determined and entirely one-sided manner for the better part of 2 years. Margaret was 47 and sharp-tongued, and possessed of an opinion about Aaron Ford that was somewhere between proprietary and annoyed, as if she had decided he was hers to disapprove of and resented any competition for the privilege. She found occasion to come out to the farm on the 8th day, under the pretense of delivering a supply order he had placed, and she arrived while Aaron and Susan were at the well together, washing the chaff and grime off their hands before supper. Margaret took in the scene, Aaron and Susan at the well, close together in the easy proximity of people who have been working side by side for days, both dusty, both laughing at something as they washed up, Aaron's hand briefly catching Susan's wrist to redirect the water bucket with the expression of someone reading a verdict. She delivered the supply order. She was cordial to Susan in the way that people are cordial to someone they have already decided to disapprove of, but cannot yet find cause. She said everything that needed to be said about the order, and then spent an additional 10 minutes standing in the yard talking to Aaron about nothing in particular, which Aaron found both transparent and mildly exhausting. He answered her questions with patience. Susan went inside to start supper, and Aaron watched her go and was aware of Margaret watching him watch her. "She seems capable enough," Margaret said, in a tone that meant she was assessing more than capability. "She is exceptional," Aaron said, which was not what he had meant to say but was entirely true. Margaret's expression shifted by about 2 degrees in a direction Aaron could not immediately classify. She said goodbye shortly after. That evening, over a supper of beans and salt pork and the first cornbread Susan had made, which was considerably better than Aaron's version, he told Susan about Harlan and Margaret and the general arc of social observation they were currently navigating, expecting her to find it amusing. She did find it amusing, but there was something else in her expression too, something that came and went before he could read it. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "What people think?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at her plate. "It would bother me if I had done something worth being ashamed of," she said at last. "I have not. I came here to work, I am working, and I am being paid fair wages for honest labor." She looked up. "I do not particularly need the approval of people who have not spent a single hour in this field." "Neither do I," Aaron said. Something passed between them in the silence that followed, a kind of mutual recognition, the acknowledgement of a shared view of the world that was more intimate in its way than many things people said directly to one another. Aaron felt it register in his chest and chose not to examine it too closely, because there were things it was better not to name until you were certain of them. He poured her more coffee. She thanked him. They talked about the field, how much was left, what the weather might do, whether the north section would need a second pass, until the lantern burned low and the night insects raised their chorus outside, and the world outside the small, warm kitchen felt very large and very quiet. On the 10th day, it rained. Not a gentle rain, but a hard, driving rain that came in fast from the northwest in the late morning and turned the cut wheat on the ground to a problem and the uncut wheat to a more urgent problem. Aaron was in the field when it hit and ran for the barn. Susan was already there, having seen it coming first. She was standing in the barn door looking at the sky with her arms crossed, calculating. "We need to get the cut sheaves under cover," she said. "If they stay wet, they'll mold." "I know," he said, "but it's coming down hard." "Yes," she agreed, and picked up a tarp from the barn wall and walked back out into the rain. Aaron stared after her for approximately 2 seconds before he grabbed a second tarp and followed. They worked in the rain for 2 hours, getting the cut sheaves stacked and covered, moving fast and getting soaked through entirely. The rain was cold, which was the first real hint of autumn, and by the time they had done what could be done, they were both dripping and shivering slightly and thoroughly impractical to look at. They came back into the barn and Susan pushed her wet hair back from her face and laughed, suddenly and thoroughly, a real laugh, the best one he had heard from her yet, full and unguarded. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "I look a fright," she said. "You look like someone who just saved half the harvest in a rainstorm," he said. She looked at him, still slightly laughing, her hair dark with rain and her face bright with cold and exertion. And for a moment the thing that had been building quietly in Aaron Ford's chest for 10 days pressed very close to the surface. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the rain hammered the barn roof, and neither of them said anything. Then Susan looked away first and said they should get dry and warm, and Aaron agreed, and they went inside. That night the rain kept on, and they sat by the stove in the kitchen with their clothes dried and the lamp burning between them, and Aaron got out a deck of cards he kept in the kitchen drawer, and they played two-handed casino for an hour, and it was the most comfortable evening Aaron could remember in a very long time. Susan was good at cards, better than him, and she won 3 times in 5 hands and did not pretend otherwise, which he found genuinely delightful. "Your father teach you cards too?" he asked. "No," she said. "A very disreputable uncle on my mother's side. He was the best card player in Lawrence County and also the most broke, which I believe is a lesson of some kind." Aaron laughed. "My father taught me cards," he said. "He was not good at them either. We played most winter evenings when the work was done. He said it kept his mind from the cold." "Did it?" "I think it kept him in company," Aaron said a little more quietly. "The cold was there either way." Susan looked at him for a moment with something careful in her expression, something that was reading between his words without pressing on them. "You miss him," she said. "Every day," he said. "I know that," she said simply. "I know that exactly." And she dealt the next hand. The rain cleared by morning. The ground was wet but not impassable. They went back to the field and the work continued. On the 13th day, Aaron rode into Calvert Creek for supplies and to see about a hired mule at the livery, because Patience was still not quite at full strength. He was at the mercantile loading his saddlebags when Will Chambers, who was the county's land agent and a man whose primary talent seemed to be delivering bad news, pulled up on the street and hailed him. "Ford," Will said, "I was about to ride out to your place." "That doesn't sound promising," Aaron said. Will came off his horse and into the mercantile out of the sun, and lowered his voice in the particular way that meant he was about to say something he wanted to seem casual. "You know Aldridge." Aaron knew Aldridge. James Aldridge was the largest landowner in the county, had been for 15 years, and had been making quiet inquiries about the Ford property for the better part of 3 years. He was not a malicious man exactly, but he was an acquisitive one, and he had a particular patience for waiting out smaller farmers in trouble. "He's made an offer," Will said, "on your property." "It's a fair offer," given he glanced at Aaron with a look that was trying to be diplomatic about the word trouble, given the circumstances of the last 2 years. "I am not selling," Aaron said. "It's a fair offer, Aaron, more than fair maybe." "I am not selling," Aaron said again. "Tell Aldridge thank you for his interest and that the Ford property is not available." Will looked at him with the resigned expression of a man who had delivered the message and discharged his duty. "Things any better out there?" he asked. "Things are considerably better," Aaron said, and he felt the truth of it in a way that went deeper than just the harvest. He rode home in the afternoon light with the supplies and a rented mule from the livery, and found Susan in the barn, her sleeves rolled up as always, working on one of the cut wheat sheaves that had gotten wet in the rain and needed turning. She heard him ride in and came to the barn door, shading her eyes against the sun. "Any news in town?" she asked. "Aldridge is trying to buy the property," he said. He was watching her face as he said it. Something moved across her expression, concern or something sharper than concern. "Are you going to sell?" "No," she nodded. She looked at the house, then back at him. "Good," she said. "It would be a shame." And then she went back to the sheaves. He unsaddled the horse and stood in the barn for a moment thinking about the way she had said that. It would be a shame. As if the farm was already something she had some stake in. As if its loss would be her loss too. He did not think she had meant anything by it beyond ordinary feeling. But he held the words for a moment anyway, turning them over quietly, and then went to help her with the sheaves. 2 days later, they were working the east section of the field in the morning when Susan paused and straightened and put a hand to her back in the way that meant the long muscles were screaming. which they both did a dozen times a day by now without comment. But this time Aaron was close by and he saw it and he said, "Sit down a minute." And she started to say she was fine and he said, "I know you are, sit down anyway." She sat down on the low stone wall at the edge of the field and he sat beside her and they looked at what was left. There was not much left. Maybe 3 more days of work, 2 if the weather held and the rented mule kept cooperating. The field that had seemed infinite 2 weeks ago was now mostly cut, the wheat gathered and stacked, the work almost done. "We are going to make it," Aaron said. "We were always going to make it," Susan said, but she said it with a certainty that sounded today less like her usual plain competence and more like faith, the particular kind of faith that comes from having done the work. The sun was full and warm, and the field smelled of cut grain and warm earth. Susan tilted her face toward it with her eyes closed for a moment, just feeling it, and Aaron watched her and felt something so clear and strong that it frightened him with its clarity. He looked away. He looked at the field. "Susan," he said. "Yes," she said, eyes still closed. "When the harvest is done," he said, and stopped. She opened her eyes and looked at him. There was a quality of stillness in her face that was different from her usual composure, more deliberate, more careful. "When the harvest is done," he said again, "I would like it if you stayed." The words sat between them in the warm air. She looked at him for a long moment, reading him with those steady dark eyes, and he looked back and did not try to be anything other than what he was, which was a man who had found someone who worked beside him the way the right tool fits the right hand, and who had also managed to occupy entirely without permission a part of him he had thought was no longer in the business of being occupied. "Why?" she said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "Because you counted the rows when I had stopped," he said. "Because you walked out into the rain without a second thought. Because you know cards and medicine for mules and how to file down a steel pin to the right gauge in the dark. Because you made the best cornbread I have eaten in 3 years, and because you do not waste time on things that are not real." He paused. "And because I think," he stopped, looked at his hands, looked back at her, "I think I would like to know what it is like to have someone beside me in a way that is more permanent than a working season." Susan was quiet. She looked at the field again. A hawk, perhaps the same hawk, perhaps a different one, was tracing wide circles above the far end of the property. "I have been on my own a long time," she said. "My mother and then the farm by myself and then the road. I have managed. I am not someone who needs," she paused over the word rescue. "I know that," he said. "I have watched you for 2 weeks. I know exactly that." "Then you should also know," she said, "that I did not come here hoping for anything except honest wages and honest work. I did not come here looking for—" She paused again. "Neither did I," he said quietly. "Find the other thing, I mean." She looked at him again, and this time the careful composure was still there, but behind it was something else, something that had been there for days, he realized, if he had been paying close enough attention, which he perhaps had been without admitting it to himself. A warmth that she had been holding at a distance with the careful architecture of her practicality. "If I stayed," she said slowly, "it would not be as a hired hand." "No," he agreed, "it would not." "You are not merely offering me continued employment," she said. "No," he said again, "I am not." He looked at her directly. "I am asking you to consider something more than that when you are ready to consider it. I am not asking for an answer right now." She looked at him for a long time. The field breathed around them. The hawks circled. Somewhere over by the barn, Patience made a low sound like a comment. "All right," Susan said at last. "I will consider it." And then she stood up, straightened her skirts, picked up her scythe, and went back to the wheat. But as she walked back into the standing grain, Aaron saw, from the angle he was sitting at, that she was smiling. Not the quick, bright match strike of her usual humor, but something slower and deeper and more private, a smile that was entirely for herself, that she was not making any attempt to suppress, and which she probably did not know he could see. He sat for another moment on the stone wall, feeling the sun, feeling the land, feeling something warm and complex and genuinely good move through him like the first real warmth after a long winter. Then he got up and went back to work. The last 3 days of harvest were both harder and easier than anything that had come before. Harder because they were tired all the way through now, the kind of tired that no single night's sleep could touch, the accumulated weight of 2 weeks of dawn-to-dusk work. Easier because the end was visible, because the field that had been impossible was now almost done. There is a particular quality of energy that comes with the sight of the finish, a second wind that is less about the body and more about something the soul does when it can see the shape of completion. They moved through the last sections of wheat like two people who had learned each other the way you learn a song, knowing the rhythm, matching the pace, covering different ground without collision. Aaron found himself looking at her frequently, not in a mooning, useless way, but in the way you look at something you want to be sure is still there. She caught him at it twice. The first time she raised an eyebrow and looked away. The second time she raised the eyebrow again, but there was that private smile underneath it. On the final evening, they finished the last section as the sun was going down in a spectacular show of orange and rose behind the western tree line. The field was cut. The wheat was harvested. The work was done. They stood at the edge of the stubbled field in the dying light, shoulder to shoulder, looking at what they had done together. Aaron felt something settle through him that was not just completion but transformation, as if the work and the weeks and the woman beside him had rearranged some fundamental thing inside him that had been disordered for a long time. "We did it," he said. "We did," she agreed. "You counted the rows," he said. She turned and looked at him, and the evening light on her face was the most beautiful thing in Aaron Ford's recent life. And he did not say that out loud because some things, said out loud, lose the weight of what they are. But he looked at her and she looked at him, and the field spread behind her and the sky was enormous above them, and he said, "Susan." "Yes," she said. "I'm no longer asking you to consider it later," he said. "I'm asking now." She stood looking at him in the golden light, and she held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said, "I know," and she stepped the half-step between them and took his hand in both of hers, turning it over and looking at it, his work-roughened, sun-darkened hand the way she looked at the field and the rig and the steel pins in the lantern light, with clear-eyed attention, as if it mattered to her, as if he mattered to her. "I will stay," she said. He closed his fingers around her hands. The sky burned orange and rose. Behind them, the harvested field breathed in the evening air. "Good," he said softly. She laughed, that bright, clean laugh, and he felt it in his chest like a bell struck once, clear and ringing. He squeezed her hands and she looked up at him, and he bent and kissed her forehead once, quietly, a thing that was not a declaration so much as a promise, and she leaned into it briefly before straightening and looking at him with that combination of warmth and clear-eyed directness that was entirely her. "You should know," she said, "that I have standards." "I would expect nothing less," he said, "and opinions. I have noticed. And I am not going to stop rolling up my sleeves simply because we are," she paused, considered her words more than employer and employee. "I would not want you to," he said. "I sincerely would not want you to." She looked at him for a moment more. Something shifted in her face, something that let more of the warmth through, and then she said, "Good," and turned toward the house, still holding one of his hands, and he went with her in the evening light across the stubbled field toward the farmhouse that sat low and sturdy against the darkening sky. The nights grew cooler as September rolled into October. The wheat was harvested and in storage, and the thrashing had been arranged with the county cooperative, and the immediate crisis was over. What replaced the crisis was something different and considerably more interesting. Living alongside someone in the close quarters of a working farm, Aaron discovered, was both more complicated and more rewarding than he had known. Susan had opinions about where things were stored. She reorganized the kitchen one afternoon while he was out checking fences, not drastically, but enough that he reached for things in the wrong place 3 times in a row, and stood in the kitchen looking baffled while she watched from the table with barely contained amusement. "The flour is now on the left shelf," she said helpfully. "I noticed," he said, "it is closer to the baking area." "That is logical," he admitted. "I thought so." He moved the flour canister back to the right shelf when she was out at the barn, and she moved it back to the left that evening. And they looked at each other across the table and both started laughing at the same time. And that was the moment Aaron Ford knew with absolute certainty that he was in love with Susan Monroe. Not because she moved the flour canister, but because of the laugh, because of the look that went with it, because of the comfortable realness of it. Two people who could argue about the placement of a flour canister and find it funny. He was going to need to have a more formal conversation. He thought about it for a week, which was not like him. Aaron was not typically a person who thought long about things he intended to do, but this was different. This was not the kind of decision where being wrong had modest consequences. This was the kind of decision that involved another person's life, another person's future, and Susan Monroe was not the kind of woman you asked things of carelessly. The conversation presented itself, eventually, not as something he had arranged, but as something the day arranged for them. They had ridden out together on a mid-October afternoon to look at the north pasture fence, which needed inspection before winter. It was a fine day, the sky an October blue that was cleaner and more serious than summer's blue, with a good sharp wind from the northwest that smelled of approaching autumn. They rode side by side on the two horses, Aaron on his gray gelding, and Susan on the bay she had arrived in, which he had bought from her at fair price because it was a good horse, and she had offered it as a reasonable arrangement. They rode the fence line and Aaron made notes, and Susan pointed out two places where the wire had gone slack that he had missed. And then they came to the top of the small ridge at the north edge of the property and stopped, because you always stop there. From the ridge you could see the whole farm, the house and the barn, the harvested fields, the woodlot to the south, the creek that ran along the western edge, the long reaches of Kansas sky and grass beyond the property lines. It was, Aaron had always thought, the best view of the place. His father had thought so too. They had stood on this ridge together when Aaron was a boy and his father had said, "Son, a man who cannot see his whole life from one high place is missing something." At the time, Aaron had not entirely understood it. He understood it better now. "Tell me what you see," he said to Susan. She looked at the farm. She was quiet for a moment, sitting easy in the saddle, the wind moving in her dark hair. "Work," she said. "A great deal of work still to do." She paused. "But good land, sound land, a place worth keeping." "It is," he said. She looked at him. "Susan," he said, "I have been thinking since the harvest about what I want to say to you and how to say it, and I have decided that the most honest thing is simply to say it directly." "I would prefer that," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. He watched her face. She was very still. "I do not know precisely when it happened. Somewhere between you packing the mule's hooves and moving my flour canister. But it happened, and I am not a man who says things he does not mean, and I want you to know that when I say I want you to stay, that I want you here, on this land, in this life. I am not asking because I need a farmhand. I am asking because I cannot imagine any version of this place going forward that does not have you in it." The wind moved between them. Susan looked at him for a long time, the kind of look that was reading all the way down. "I have been alone a long time," she said, and he heard in it the echo of what she had said at the stone wall in the field, but softer now, less a wall than an admission. "I learned to be careful with my own heart because there was no one else to be careful with it. I do not say that to make you feel sorry for me. I say it because I need you to understand that I do not come to this easily." "I know," he said. "I do not want easy. I want real." She looked at him. Something in her face opened. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the way a door opens in a house where someone has been waiting a long time quietly and with a quality of finality. "I love you," she said. "I think I have been loving you since you came down off that porch in the morning and looked at the field like it had beaten you, and then looked at me like I might be the one reason not to let it." She paused. "That is the kind of man I have been waiting to find. Someone who knows what it is to be losing and still does not give up." He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, and she let him, closing her fingers around his with a grip that was steady and certain. "Marry me," he said. It was not a question quite, but it was not an order either. It was something that fell exactly between request and statement, which was exactly how he meant it. She looked at him on the ridge above the farm they had saved together, with the Kansas sky enormous and clean above them and the harvested fields below, and the full weight of a life stretching forward in every direction. And she said, "Yes, of course, yes." They rode back down to the farm in the afternoon light, side by side, and the distance between them was less than it had ever been, and the world was large and workable and theirs. They were married in November, a small ceremony in the Calvert Creek Church with Reverend Howell officiating, and a gathering of perhaps 20 people, including Harlan Briggs and his family, who came with the somewhat shamefaced energy of people who had been wrong about something and knew it. Tommy Briggs, the neighbor boy, stood in the back and grinned at Susan with sincere admiration, and she smiled back at him in a way that was warm and genuine and entirely without complication, which was very much her way. Margaret Tilby came too, in a dress that was somewhat more elaborate than the occasion perhaps called for, and she shook Aaron's hand and shook Susan's hand and said that she wished them well, and Aaron believed she meant it, underneath whatever complicated feelings she was also managing, because Margaret Tilby was ultimately not a small person. Susan wore a dress of dark green wool that she had had in her trunk, which she had never worn but had kept, she said, for an occasion that felt worth it. She wore her dark hair pinned up with a spray of small dried flowers she had found in the fields, cream-colored flowers that had gone to seed but held their shape. She carried a small Bible that had been her mother's. She stood beside Aaron in front of Reverend Howell and said her vows in a clear voice with a full, steady gaze that was exactly how she said everything, and Aaron said his in the same way, and the 20 people in the pews felt something of the quality of the thing that was happening at the front of the church, which was not just ceremony but confirmation, 2 people making real in front of witnesses what was already real. When Reverend Howell said they were husband and wife and Aaron kissed her briefly, because there were 20 people watching and he was not a theatrical man, she looked at him afterward with those dark eyes bright and warm and the private smile that was his favorite thing in his current life. "Well," she said quietly, under her breath, echoing what she had said in the barn the day they stood dripping from the rainstorm. "Well," he agreed. The winter was hard in the way that Kansas winters were hard, which was to say completely and without apology. But hard winters on a farm that is well prepared are different from hard winters on a farm that is struggling, and for the first time in 3 years the Ford farm was well prepared. The wheat was stored, the wood was cut, the fences were sound, and the repairs that had been deferred for 2 years had been made, many of them by Susan in the fall weeks after the harvest when there was still daylight and not yet frost. The barn was tight. The house was warm. They were inside together for long stretches, and Aaron discovered what he perhaps should have already known, which was that being inside together for long stretches with someone you have chosen freely, and who has chosen you freely, is not imprisonment but the deepest kind of ease. They read to each other in the evenings. Aaron had a small collection of books his father had kept, novels and almanacs, and a volume of poems by Longfellow that he had never opened but Susan had, and she read from it sometimes in the evenings by the stove in a quiet voice that made the poems sound like conversation. They played cards. They argued, occasionally, about the kinds of things that people who are genuinely building a life together argue about: money, plans, what the spring planting should look like, whether to repair the barn roof entirely or patch it for another year. They argued with the productive friction of 2 people who both had opinions and neither of whom needed to win for the sake of winning, which meant they usually arrived somewhere good. Aaron had not known it could be this way. He had believed, somewhere in the back of his thinking, that this kind of closeness, this daily, ordinary, deeply specific intimacy, was the province of people luckier or different from himself. He had not expected it to be the result of a harvest advertisement in the Wichita paper. In the deep of January, when the snow lay thick over the Kansas plain and the sky was the color of pewter, Susan told him she was pregnant. She told him at breakfast, directly, the way she told him everything, sitting across the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee mug and her eyes on his face. He looked at her for a moment, at the directness of her gaze and the small, private warmth behind it, and then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He laughed. A full, deep, genuinely surprised and genuinely happy laugh that was so different from his usual quality of expression that Susan blinked at it and then laughed too, and they sat across from each other in the cold kitchen laughing at the fact of the life they were building, which was growing faster and more substantially than even they had planned. "In summer?" he asked. "June, I think," she said. "The slow season," he said, "between planting and harvest." "I timed it well," she said. "You absolutely did," he said, and reached across the table and covered her hands with his, and she turned her hands over and held on. He rode to Calvert Creek the next day through the snow to see Reverend Howell, not for any particular official purpose, but because he wanted to tell someone, and Howell was the person he thought of, which surprised him slightly and then didn't. He found the Reverend in the church, repairing a pew, and told him, and Howell straightened and shook his hand and said something that Aaron held onto in the weeks that followed, which was, "A man who is afraid to receive good things is not humble, Aaron. He is only afraid. Receive it fully." He went home and received it fully. Spring came in March, wet and cold, and then warmer, and then genuinely warm, and with it all the urgency and promise of planting season. Susan worked as long as she comfortably could, which was considerably longer than most would have, because she was not built for sitting still, and the farm was not the kind of place where sitting still was an option anyway. She helped with the spring plowing and the planting and the fence repairs and a half-dozen other things, modifying what she did as her condition required, but not stopping, because stopping was not her nature. Aaron hovered. He was trying not to hover, because he knew she did not want that and that she was entirely capable, and he was being what he privately acknowledged was somewhat irrational, but the hovering impulse was strong and she caught him at it frequently. "I am not made of glass," she said one April afternoon when she found him watching her from the porch with the particular expression she had come to recognize. "I know that," he said. "Then stop looking at me like I might fall apart." "I am just watching you," he said. "I like watching you." She gave him a look that was trying to be exasperated and not entirely succeeding. "You are ridiculous," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "I'm working on it." She came up to the porch and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her, his hand flat on the curve of her waist, and she leaned into him briefly, and they stood looking at the spring fields together, the new green of the wheat just showing in the turned earth, the sky enormous and blue and full of possibility. "It is a good farm," she said. "It is," he said. "We are going to be fine," she said, not as reassurance for him or not only for him, as a statement of fact, as the kind of certainty that is not optimism but assessment. "I know," he said. The baby came in the second week of June, which was as she had predicted, and it was a boy. He arrived in the early morning hours with help from the midwife, Martha Cole, who drove out from Calvert Creek, and who was a pragmatic, clear-eyed woman of 60, who had delivered most of Callaway County's current population, and had opinions about everything. Aaron sat outside the bedroom door for 3 hours in the condition of a man who is maintaining an exterior of calm by pure structural effort, while his interior is doing something closer to a controlled explosion. He had spoken to Martha twice through the door, asking if everything was proceeding as it should, and she had told him both times in approximately the same tone she would have used for a slow farm animal that yes, things were proceeding as they should, and if anything changed she would tell him, and could he please stop knocking. He heard the baby cry, and it was the most arresting sound he had ever encountered, sharp and declarative and entirely real, and he sat with his head against the wall and breathed. Martha opened the door after a few minutes and said he could come in. Susan was in the bed, pale with the work of it but entirely herself, holding a small wrapped bundle against her chest with both arms, and looking at it with an expression Aaron had not seen on her before, not her working face, not her laughing face, not even the warm, open face that was his in private moments. Something more than all of those, something deeper and more startled. As if the world had turned out to contain something she had not fully prepared for, even though she had been preparing for it for months. She looked up when he came to the bedside, and her expression shifted into the warm version that was for him, and she held out the bundle slightly, presenting it. It was a boy. Red-faced and wrinkled and shockingly alive, and possessed already of a serious inward expression that Aaron thought privately looked somewhat like Susan, which he considered an excellent sign. "Hello," Aaron said to his son, which was wholly inadequate to the situation and completely genuine. "His name," Susan said, "should be something real, something that means something." "Elias," Aaron said without hesitation. "For my father." She looked at him. "Yes," she said softly. "Elias Ford." She looked at the baby. "Yes, I think that suits him." Aaron sat on the edge of the bed and put one arm around Susan carefully, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and little Elias Ford looked at the ceiling with the intense, slightly outraged expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere and has not yet decided what he thinks of it. "Thank you," Aaron said into Susan's hair. "For what?" she said. "For showing up," he said. "For showing up and rolling up your sleeves." She made a small sound that was half laugh and half something more than that, and she turned her face briefly against his shoulder, and then straightened and looked at her son with clear eyes and a steady mouth, and the expression of someone who is ready for whatever comes next. The years on the Ford farm did not become simple. No years on a Kansas farm in the 1880s were simple. The work was constant, the weather was capricious, and the economics of farming in an era of consolidation and railroad influence were genuinely complex in ways that required real intelligence to navigate. There were bad seasons and good ones. There were years when the grasshoppers came through a neighboring county, and they watched the sky from the ridge and hoped. There were years when the wheat was so good that the price dropped because everyone's wheat was so good, which was the particular cruelty of agricultural markets. And Aaron and Susan sat at the kitchen table with the ledger between them and worked the numbers with the practical creativity of people who had no option not to. But the farm stayed. Aaron Ford never sold to James Aldridge, who made one more offer in 1884 and then stopped asking, perhaps because he recognized the quality of the resistance. The property grew, in fact, a modest expansion to the east in 1886 when the adjacent lot came available and Aaron could afford it, which he could because 2 consecutive good harvests had cleared most of his remaining debt. The expansion required more labor than they had, and Aaron advertised again in the Wichita paper, which Susan found almost unbearably funny. "You are looking for another me," she said. "There is only one of you," he said. "I am looking for 2 reasonable men who can drive a rig." They found them, eventually, a pair of brothers from Missouri, Frank and George Delaney, who were 20 and 23 respectively, and who turned out to be competent and amiable and good-humored, and who treated Susan with the combination of respect and slight wariness that she generally inspired in people who had never seen a woman reorganize a kitchen and repair a harvesting rig in the same week. Little Elias grew quickly, as small children on farms do, because there is no shortage of things to engage a curious mind on a working farm, and no one has time to manage his curiosity as carefully as they might in a more leisurely life. He was a serious, watchful child at first, and then, somewhere around the age of 2, he discovered that making his parents laugh was one of the most reliable satisfactions in the world, and he became something considerably less serious. He followed Aaron into the fields before he could manage a full sentence, walking unsteadily behind him through the wheat stubble with intense concentration, and he followed Susan into the barn and attempted to assist with the mule's hooves with the blind confidence of someone who does not yet know the concept of being unqualified for a task. "He is fearless," Aaron said one evening, watching his son attempt to climb the lower rail of the corral fence for the fourth time. "He is mine," Susan said, with a dry satisfaction that was her particular form of pride. "He is mine too," Aaron said. "You are considerably less fearless," she said. "I have more information," he said. She laughed. In the autumn of 1885, Susan told him she was pregnant again, this time in December, which she announced with the same directness as the first time, sitting across the kitchen table in the lamplight. "Summer again?" he asked. "July, I think." "You have excellent timing," he said. "Consistently," she agreed. This one was a girl, arrived in July as predicted, with a quantity of dark hair that was entirely from her mother and an expression in her first days that was more open than her brother's had been, more immediately seeking, as if she had arrived with questions rather than assessments. They named her Clara, after Susan's mother, and Susan held her in the days after her birth with the same depth of expression she had held Elia's, and Aaron watched his wife with his daughter, and felt the particular quality of full that it was hard to name precisely, the condition of having more good than you had been taught to expect from the world. Elias, at nearly 3, regarded his sister with a complicated mixture of fascination and suspicion that resolved, over the weeks that followed, into a proprietary affection that manifested as standing very close to wherever Clara was, and watching people approach her with the serious, slightly warning look of someone who has decided that oversight is his responsibility. "He is going to be an excellent older brother," Susan said. "He is going to drive the boy she eventually likes completely off this property," Aaron said. "Good," said Susan. Life on the Ford farm in the late 1880s had the quality that good lives have, which is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something worth the difficulty. There were arguments about the farm's direction, and about money, and about the children's education. Susan was firmly in favor of sending both children to the Calvert Creek School when the time came, and had opinions about what they should learn there, and about smaller things, the daily friction of two people living fully in the same space. But the arguments were real arguments, the kind that produced something, and the resolutions were real too. Harlan Briggs became, over the years, something close to a genuine friend to both of them, his initial skepticism having been comprehensively dissolved by the evidence of Susan Monroe Ford's character and capability, which were both formidable and demonstrable. Tommy Briggs grew into a young man who came to help during the big harvests every year, and who regarded Susan as something between an older sister and a natural force of the frontier, which was, Aaron thought, roughly accurate. In 1887, a bad drought hit the county, and it hit the Ford farm along with everyone else. The wheat crop that year was perhaps 40% of what it should have been. It was the worst season Aaron had faced since his father died. He stood at the edge of the field in August and looked at the thin, stressed stalks and felt the old weight of it, the particular hopelessness that the land could produce in a bad year, reaching back for him like something he had thought he had escaped. Susan stood beside him. She put her hand in his without looking at him, and he held it, and they stood looking at the poor field together in the August heat. "We have the savings from the last 2 years," she said after a while. "It will be tight," he said. "Tight," she agreed, "is not the same as undone." He looked at her. She looked at the field with that clear, assessing, unafraid gaze that had not changed since the morning she had arrived in the yard with her sleeves already rolled, and she said, "We are not going to lose this land. We have too much of ourselves in it." "I know," he said. "Then let us go figure out the numbers," she said, and she turned from the field toward the house, still holding his hand, and he went with her. They worked through the drought year. It was genuinely hard. There was less than they were accustomed to. But she was right, as she generally was about things that were accessible, and they came out the other side of it intact, if tired. The following year was better. The year after that was very good. By 1889, the Ford farm was one of the more solid operations in Callaway County, not the largest, not the flashiest, but the kind of place that persisted, that improved incrementally over time, that had the quality of having been built by people who intended to stay. The barn had been rebuilt properly, with good timber. The house had been extended. Another room had been added on the east side, making a real spare bedroom instead of the tight sewing room where Susan had slept her first night. The kitchen was larger, the stove was new. The table was solid walnut that Aaron had built over a winter with more patience than he had previously known himself to possess. Elia started school in the fall of 1888 and came home every day with information that he delivered to his parents in the detailed, slightly solemn manner of someone reporting on a great expedition. And Susan listened to all of it with full attention and asked real questions. And Elia's expanded in the sun of being taken seriously. Clara, at 4, had developed a fierce enthusiasm for the horses that was only barely manageable, and a habit of following Susan into every corner of the farm that had given her a working vocabulary of agricultural procedure that was considerably more advanced than most children her age, which her teacher the following year would find both impressive and slightly alarming. In the evenings, Aaron and Susan still sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, sometimes with the ledger, sometimes with the cards, sometimes just with the coffee. The quality of their silence together was one of the things Aaron valued most in his life, not a silence of absence, but of fullness, the kind that belongs to people who have said enough real things to each other that the quiet between sentences is warm rather than empty. One October evening in 1889, 7 years after Susan had driven her buckboard into the yard, they sat on the porch in the cooling dusk. The harvest was in the best harvest yet, the new east field having performed beyond what they had projected. The children were asleep inside. The farm lay quiet and dark around them, the fields pale in the moonlight, the barn solid and dark, the whole property breathing in the October cool. 7 years, Susan said. 7 years, Aaron agreed. I did not count them, she said. They went the way that good things go. He looked at her in the moonlight. This woman who had arrived with her sleeves already rolled on the morning he had given up counting, and he felt the thing he always felt when he looked at her, which was the layered whole of all the years, the harvests and the winters and the hard seasons and the good ones, and underneath all of it the original thing, the simple fact of her, the person she was. I am still grateful, he said, that you wrote the letter. I am still grateful, she said, that you wrote back. He reached across and took her hand in the dark the same way he always had, and she turned her hand in his and held on the same way she always had. You know, she said after a moment, that I intend to be here a very long time. I know, he said. I intend to be here until that field is the best wheat field in the state of Kansas, she said, with a quiet certainty that was not ambition for its own sake, but the natural expression of someone who had given a thing their full care and intended to continue. I believe you, he said. Above them, the October sky was full of stars, the particular October density of stars that you get in Kansas when the air has gone clean and dry, and the horizon is flat in every direction, and there is nothing between you and the sky except the space you occupy in the dark. Aaron Ford, who had stood at the edge of his unharvested field one September morning and looked at the impossible rows and felt himself at the end of something, looked at that sky and felt clearly, and with the full weight of a man who had learned to receive good things, that what he had found in the years since was not a remedy for difficulty. The difficulty had continued. The world offered nothing that kept the drought away or made the prices fair or guaranteed a good yield. What he had found was something different from a remedy. He had found someone who counted the rows when he had stopped, someone who showed up with her sleeves already rolled, someone who walked into the rain because the work needed doing and did not wait to be asked. He had found Susan Monroe, and she had found him, and together they had made something real out of the particular kind of impossible that is just very, very hard, which is a different thing altogether. He thought of his father on this ridge, saying a man who cannot see his whole life from one high place is missing something. He thought of the hawks circling in the white morning when he was at the end of his counting. He thought of the sound of the buckboard coming up the road. "Susan," he said. "Yes," she said in the warm, unhurried voice of someone who is entirely where she means to be. "Thank you," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said in the voice that was for him the warm, private voice behind the composure, "You have said that before." "I will keep saying it," he said. She squeezed his hand, and he squeezed hers back, and the stars were enormous above the Ford farm in October of 1889, and the wheat was in, and the children were asleep, and the land stretched out dark and quiet and entirely theirs. And inside the farmhouse that Aaron's father had built and Aaron had kept and Susan had helped to save, there was a solid table of walnut wood and 2 worn chairs and a shelf with a small collection of books that had grown over the years and a ledger that, for the first time in a long time, was reading in a direction that pointed forward instead of down. And on the porch in the cooling dark, 2 people who had found each other in the urgent and particular way of the harvest sat side by side in the manner of people who intend to remain, and remained. The following spring, Susan mentioned over breakfast that she thought the north pasture could support a small apple orchard if they cleared the northeast corner and put in the time and the right stock. And Aaron looked at her over his coffee and thought about the apple trees blooming in 20 years, and Clara picking apples, and Elia's children picking apples, and every generation after that looking up at the trees that Susan Monroe Ford had planted because she had seen the possibility in a piece of ground that everyone else had written off as pasture. "When do you want to start?" he said. She pushed up her sleeves. "Now," she said.